This is the brief history of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is currently one of the two biggest political parties in the United States, the other being the Republican Party. Origins of the Democratic Party can be traced back to Thomas Jefferson, who personally believed in the rights of the individual man, ironically creating a political party known as the Democratic Republicans. Republicans because of his views being anti-monarchy. Also known as Jeffersonians, they ruled most of the post-George Washington era for roughly 30 years before becoming bloated and bureaucratic as many political parties tend to get. Disenfranchised and in particular being screwed out of their candidate of choice in the election of 1824, that man being Andrew Jackson, formed a large group and coalition that would ultimately break up the Jeffersonians, creating what is the Democratic Party. The leaders usually attributed to the creation of the Democratic Party are John C. Calhoun, the prestigious South Carolina senator, Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States of America, and Old Hickory himself, Andrew Jackson. The party formed and consolidated largely in the southern states as the People's Party. The Democratic nominee again in 1828, Andrew Jackson, would win this time, starting what is now a 2-century history for the Democratic Party. Now, there are roughly 8 eras in the history of the Democratic Party, each era having its own leaders, views, that would also define the party in that time. The first era is the Jacksonian era, ranging from Andrew Jackson himself to roughly the time of James Buchanan and the start of the Civil War. This era was defined by Andrew Jackson and his policies, dominated by Southern support, usually for a pro-slavery and agricultural economy focusing on domestic trade rather than foreign money. Initially buoyed by the people and popularity of Andrew Jackson, the party was largely supported by the working class people and generally the southern states. Over time during this era, starting with an aggressive push for less federal government, slowly over time turned into malaise, weak and power-hungry leaders, indecisiveness, and debatably so, a push for more international recognition, the Mexican-American War being the prime example. The Democratic Party took advantage and became complacent in many aspects that would lead to the Civil War. The next era is the post-Civil War era that stretches from the Civil War through Grover Cleveland's first term as president in the mid-1880s. This era is defined by the hostile nature between the North and the South that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Democrats openly leaving the Union, most politicians leaving the Union, except for a handful, usually in places like Tennessee and Virginia. The previous era had lost its way, but honestly and primarily, this era is defined as anything that wasn't Republican, Democrats largely opposing and wanting more smaller governments that reduced the reach of what Congress could and or could not do. Some say an attempt to go back to certain aspects of Jacksonian conservatism. Despite overwhelming Republican support at this time, Democrats were able to make gains in various different places, largely losing the recognition of just the Confederate South to a more anti-government party, appealing to many people of that time who were coming onto the political scene, as well as the overwhelming corruption of the Republican Party. This led them almost winning in 1876, surprising many by winning a couple of supposedly strong Republican states, New York being one as an example. The lack of a strong political leader of this time and era, and really the subsequent decades, forced the Democratic Party to try and see new ways of winning and becoming relevant as a political party again. The next era is the Grover Cleveland era, which is largely just his 2 non-consecutive terms as president. This era is 2 things. The first, strong leader the Democratic Party has had in decades, and secondly, the last truly and definitively conservative president in policy Democrats will ever have at this point in time. It is defined as quite literally by Grover Cleveland, whose presidencies go from 1884 till 1896, where Democrats largely were going through an ongoing identity crisis. Still conservative by most standards and the support of Grover Cleveland somewhat strong, there was a real push for a progressive ideal that would shift the party in a completely new direction. Individuals that would eventually shape this direction were radical and yet brilliant people like William Jennings Bryan and more turbulent people like eventual President Woodrow Wilson, among others. 2 things Democrats constantly dealt with during this time was the rising push for more foreign intervention, places like Hawaii among other things like that as an example, and the other was a consistent monetary policy where Cleveland himself and Republicans actually usually favoring a gold standard and William Jennings Bryan, the Democrats, favoring a silver standard. This era is really the changing of the guard for what the Democratic Party would eventually become. The next era is the Wilsonian era, ranging from post-Grover Cleveland to the beginning of the FDR presidency. This era is largely the real shift of progressive politics, both socially and economically. Also, amid growing economic turmoil and inconsistency as the rise of unions are happening. Democrats had slowly but surely become the party of the working class people again, led initially by William Jennings Bryan, who would run for the presidency 3 times during this Wilsonian era. In many ways, this was the era that, along with the Republican Party in many ways, showed the levels of corruption and dysfunction the federal government can ultimately create. Woodrow Wilson is the first Democrat president elected due to Republicans infighting and pushes forth a new generation of Democrats with aggressive progressive ideals in terms of governing and economic policy, using the federal government to prop up and push forward America to many disastrous results. Still popular in many ways throughout this era despite the disastrous results of their policies being enacted. They had strong support from the strong South and young voters and also working class voters. Democrats during the Wilsonian era faced many problems, also due to political infighting, as Woodrow Wilson dominated politics around that time, and Democrats faced many issues dealing with the lack of trust in the institutions of the time. And because of all this, Republicans would consistently win, Democrats would consistently lose, searching for the next decade for the next great Democrat president. The next era is not that, though. The next era is the FDR era, ranging from his presidency and ending largely with the beginning of Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidency. That next candidate was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and in his era specifically, it is completely defined by him, foreign and domestic, using the federal government and pushing forward for more foreign influence abroad. The people loved FDR and felt safe despite the difficult economic realities of his presidency that he himself was only exacerbating and prolonging with his policies. A push for more government and a real push for more institutions, and policies such as Social Security being the most notable one, being things that showed the Democratic Party's transformation into progressive ideals in politics, despite the many hypocrisies during this time, notably Executive Order 9066 locking up the Japanese in concentration camps. Eventually, Truman takes over and largely finishes what FDR and the Democratic Party pushed for in foreign influence on the world stage. Despite the strong showings and goings during this time, Democrats never had a true or strong enough successor to match FDR, or had the Southern support such as Truman. Democrats faltered at this time, although people like Aldi Stevenson would give a shot, but not a lot of people during this time and era could match Eisenhower, as Republicans started taking back a lot of the working class base. The next era I consider the Kennedy era, ranging from Kennedy being inaugurated till roughly, I would say, the Clinton presidency. This era is defined by its turbulence and chaos, not only in America, but the political infighting that was happening not just in the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party as well. For Republicans, it was about finding a message in a clear ideological direction, and for Democrats, to put it politely, was straight up power grabs and infighting that begins directly with the Kennedy administration. Still progressive in most ways, the party slowly but pushes aggressively and shifts narratively towards the more social aspects of policy during the Civil Rights era. Once LBJ is inaugurated, he continues the more aggressive push for federal influence, creating the welfare state as we see it implemented, only to continue to fight one another, leading to no real popular candidates remaining to run near the end of the 70s. Jimmy Carter getting elected was a bit of a surprise to many people, but was more of a reaction to Republicans losing trust within the American people. This era is defined by the largest decline the Democrats would have since the post-Civil War era, with no real strong options opting to go with candidates like Walter Mondale and Hubert Humphreys as presidential candidates. The party would try to find the next Kennedy of sorts to try and wiggle their way back into the executive branch. The next era is the Clinton era, ranging from his presidency to that of Barack Obama's presidency. This era is obviously defined by Bill Clinton, and at the very least, the outward appearance of a moderate president by modern standards. The Democrat Party largely followed suit. Many prominent politicians, whether it be John Kerry, Al Gore, Madeleine Albright, among others. Usually and successfully labeling themselves as moderates by the standards of the Republican Party at the time, not to mention good media coverage, they stood out as the common sense political party that differed from the social issues in particular of the time. For instance, the AIDS epidemic, climate change, yet stood strong on crime. This era is also defined by a lack of notable leaders outside of Clinton, and still the last remnants of the old Southern Democrat, whose votes they would lose largely by the end of Obama's second term. Despite relative popularity, especially among the newer and younger generations who aggressively identified with the progressive ideals, they struggled at times during this period as Republicans had a strong and reliable voter base in comparison for Democrats. This period of note is the real and strong push for Democrats being susceptible to the influence of the federal government and the deep state, like individuals who, along with media, prop these people up even though their policies and voting records, just like Republicans in fairness, say otherwise. In fairness, there is always a deep state. It has existed from the beginning of this entire country and the history of our nation, and without a hesitation, at this particular point in the history of not just the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party as well, it is and has shown its face. The last era is the Obama era, ranging from Obama's second term to today. Strangely, I start with his second term for two reasons. One, because his first term was more influenced by the Democratic regime, and at the very least the appearance of moderate politics by the party, while his second term, and in the subsequent years since, has moved aggressively towards a progressive and almost socialist policy. Democrats of this time and era are all defined almost solely on social policies and identity politics, eschewing solid economic policy and wanting to use the federal government to fix deficiencies in the system. The push for social politics has led to some good success, albeit inflated in many aspects, that has shown up positively in support, even if the support in the social media age is inconsistent at best. Despite the strong push and at least a solid base of support overall for the party, they have more so than ever, even during FDR's time, cannibalized themselves to a point they have no strong leader or contender, ruining the hopes and prospects of several candidates, whether through media manipulation, such as the case of Tulsi Gabbard, or outright rigging conventions, like for Bernie Sanders. The party as it currently stands is slowly falling apart as we know it. But hope is that the party will change, shift, and become the party of common sense once again. Thank you guys, like and subscribe, hope you all enjoy.